Okay, so first, just to give an overview of the Power Reaper, the reason why we've all been pushing it so much, you've heard this from Jin, you've heard this from Angst, you've heard this from me for a long time, is because the Power Reaper really is the standard middle of the road class. Like if you bring this build, you will have access to a lot of really good stuff. Basically everything we want you to have access to in a raid. I still think it's the... Yes, I am talking. Slaley? One second. Can everyone hear me except for Slaley?
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, good. I was hoping I wasn't talking to myself that whole time. Do you
It's
have...
been really quiet. Can you guys hear Maeric?
And Haley can hear me in the stream. Okay, good. There we go. Okay, so you're good. So yeah, what, who is that? Is that Zen?
What?
You're gonna distract everybody. You're too flashy. All right, so the reason why we ask everyone to at least consider the Power Reaper, especially if you're learning raids, is because it really is a well-rounded class. Some of you guys play things like Guardians or Thieves or Elementalists. They have about 11k HP in a DPS build. Unless you're playing anything that has added HP, which you really shouldn't be on any of those classes, you're going to have 11k HP. For a Reaper in the same situation who's going to be doing around the same amount of damage in an actual raid, you're actually looking at about 3 times that amount of health. You have access to about 19.2k, right? So you're upwards of 20k HP. I think the total life force that you have is, what, almost 16,000. If you are in Reaper's Shroud, all the damage you take is actually done instead to the Shroud, and you take 50% of the damage you would normally take while you're in Shroud. So the total access to your health pool is going to be somewhere obscene over the course of a fight, 25 to 30k. You are way more survivable than every other DPS build out there. The only difference for comparison might be with Scourge, the other Necromancer class. They have they don't have the Shroud, but they have the same HP pool, and they also have Barrier. Okay, so in addition to all the survivability, it has a huge amount of cleave DPS. Now, you've heard us talk about cleave in raids before, or at least you should have. It's the ability to swing your sword or hit a skill against the boss and hit everything else around the boss as well. So I don't know if you can think in your head of the various fights where this has come in handy, but things like Sabbatha, things like Gorseval, things like Zera. There's countless fights where, or even Mersat when we bring the statues in, or KC when we're doing the spectral statues as well. There are tons of fights where cleave is incredibly important. It means you don't lose any damage on the boss while also being able to do the damage that we need to the rest of the ads. If you're playing something like a Thief, for example, that is like dagger, or rifle based on doing the rotation and damaging just the boss, you have 0 cleave damage, and it really does hurt the raid. So CC is the next thing on the list. CC is also another huge hindrance for certain classes. If you bring a class in that maybe does good damage or is fun, but we come up against Samurag, I'm sure most of you have seen that. That's the case where we have a decent group, we make it through Cairn, we make it through Mersat, but by the time we get to Samurag, it all falls to pieces. And because CC can be a real issue. That's another huge strength of the Reaper class. We have a bunch of CC that we have access to. There are certain classes like Hollowsmith where they have access to CC, but it's a little harder for them because if they're in a fight like Samurag where that CC is really important, for Hollowsmith, the CC skills are part of their damage rotation, which means during their normal DPS rotation, they have to hold off on using those CC skills because we're going to need them during the CC phase. So they're going to either A, lower their damage overall, or B, they're going to use them like normal and then not have access to them when we need them during the CC phase. One of the real strengths of the Power Reaper is not only do we have a ton of CC, but that CC, almost all of it, except for one skill, it is not part of our rotation, which means it's always going to be up and ready to go. And we're going to be able to snap our fingers and have access to it as soon as we need to during phases like every 10% in Samurott. Okay, and the last thing that I will end up going over is utility. The Reaper rotation, like I said, is pretty straightforward, but there's a lot of things we don't use in the rotation that you will be able to use in quality of life situations. There's a bunch of little tips and tricks, a little extra things. If you've ever learned a rotation before, or if you're like me, I go in and I learn a raid rotation on a class. I will learn it, I'll get really good on it, I'm perfect at it, but I know nothing outside of the purview of just that rotation. So somebody who actually plays that class, somebody who really knows it well, is going to be able to capitalize on things that I don't know. But I really do know Reaper, and I can teach those things. There's a ton of stuff that's going to make your life easier in an actual raid that I'll go over. Okay, so we'll start with just going over the skills. I'll show you the kinds of things we have access to as we go through. One of the things that the Reaper does really well is apply vulnerability. That's another thing that is really nice. You may not even think about it, but vulnerability application is a huge deal in raids. Making sure that something is at 25 stacks of vulnerability means 25% additional damage from literally everyone in the raid. Some raid compositions don't have good vulnerability application, and so you as a Reaper, you can be guaranteed that that's the case. So before I go into any of the skills, I'm going to give a rundown of what the build is and what skills we want on our bar. So if everyone can press H for me and go to your build, we'll sort of set that up. The 3 specialization lines are going to be Spite, Soul Reaping, and Reaper. Does anyone not have that set up? I don't want to go over them until everyone has that ready. Good? Okay. So Spite is going to be 1, 2, 2. Soul Reaping is going to be 1, 1, 2. And finally, Reaper will be 2, 1, 3. Now, if you haven't updated your build, if you've been playing Reaper already and you haven't updated, that's the thing that just changed in this last patch. The middle trait in Reaper there, the Soul Eater, that's new. If you look at it, striking foes within the range threshold deals increased damage and heals you for a portion of the damage dealt. The damage increase is 10%, so anything that you do to an enemy within melee range, 300, which is basically our entire life, is going to be increased by 10% damage. So this actually pushed our DPS up quite a bit. We were at about 29.5k DPS on the highest Snowcrow's benchmark pre-patch. Now, Snowcrow's has not come out with their own benchmarks yet, but the highest one you can find on the internet is 31.2. So we are now in a really good place. We're actually in the best place Power Reaper has ever been. The change in the rotation also, it was a little finicky for me to make the change because I wasn't used to it, but the truth is it's actually going to be even easier to explain the rotation to you than it was pre-patch. So it did not get more complicated. It's perfectly reasonable. Okay, now we're going to move on to the utility skills. Like I said, it's going to be Greatsword, Axe, Warhorn. So that's the easy part. Make sure you got that set up. The utility skills are going to be Summon Bloodfiend. That's your heal. Basically, we're never going to touch that. We're never going to want to use it. You don't want to kill our Bloodfiend. It heals us over time. And so that's a skill we're not going to have to use in our rotation. Next is Signet of Spite. That is for the passive, it improves power. That's another skill we will never have to use in our actual rotation. We will never want to click that. The next is going to be Well of Suffering. You'll see that does a crap ton of damage and also applies a bunch of vulnerability. We will use that during our rotation. Next is Summon Shadow Fiend. That is another passive damage skill. The pet is just going to be doing its own thing. We do not have to use that during our rotation, except in very specific situations, which I'll get into later, but that's not part of our DPS rotation. And finally, it's going to be Flesh Golem. And Flesh Golem, again, passive, right? It's doing its own thing. We only activate at skill when we want to do CC. So already, you can see that the class is sort of built to be able to be really manageable. We've got, of all of the skills on the right side of our health bar, we're going to be using one of them in our DPS rotation. That is it. So really convenient already. You can see that that's just going to be pretty manageable. Okay, so the weapons we're going to be using are Greatsword, Axe, Warhorn. Greatsword, by its very definition, is a cleave weapon. Literally every single thing we do is going to be melee from this, but it's also going to be cleaving. So everything around you is going to be hit by this. If you look at Well of Suffering, that's a big well. That is also going to be a huge amount of cleave damage. It's going to do damage to everything around us. The only, and of course, Reaper Shroud, even bigger cleave than Greatsword. Reaper Shroud is going to, everything we do in there is going to be a huge amount of cleave as well. The only thing that we are going to do that does not cleave is Axe 2. Okay, Axe 2 for Ghastly Claws, which we do for DPS, but mainly for the Life Force generation. That is the only thing that is single target. It's also worth noting that that is the other thing that, that's the only thing that is actually ranged damage as a Reaper. So don't discount this. You know, if you're doing Zera or you're needing to stagger things like stagger statues in Mursad Overseers that come in, if you attack something with Axe and use Ghastly Claws, it actually does a reasonable amount of damage. The same is true of Gorseval. You can do spheres with Reaper just fine. Another thing that is really good to note about Reaper is that if you target something even far away, even too far away for your Axe to use, or even your Greatsword, and you swing at it, press number 1, use a skill at it, even if I can't reach it, all of my minions are going to go to that enemy and do damage to it. This is something that is really good for a Reaper to know, because if you need to help with something far away, even if you can't reach it, you will send your minions at it and they will start doing damage to it. So that's just one of the sort of tricks you'll learn as you go, because that, you know, most of what we're going to be doing is entirely cleave and melee oriented, but in a pinch we can do some range, and just sending minions at it does contribute to that. Okay, so the next thing I'll go into is the CC skills. We have a bunch of them. Whale of Doom, which is Warhorn 4. That is a 2-second daze. Okay, so it's like a cone pattern in front of you. That is not a part of our DPS rotation, so we can access that at any time. That's a really nice thing to have. Next is Charge from our Golem. Everybody click Charge. Look at all those Flesh Golems go. It's amazing. I would love to see that in a Samurag raid. The Charge will send your Golem forward, giving it stability. It's a really weird CC, because it's basically applying and reapplying knockbacks and launches as it drags along, charging forward. So anything that it is directly hit by the Flesh Golem will be knocked back, which is the lesser form of CC. Launch is actually a greater form of CC. Anything at the edges of its hitbox will be hit by the launch effect, but when you have a big raid boss, it's kind of being hit by all of it, and that's the beauty of the Flesh Golem Charge. It's definitely our strongest CC, and it's actually on a relatively slow or quick cooldown. So it's only 40 seconds. That's affected by Alacrity. So you'll find that in most groups that you're going to be doing in Samurag, for example, it's going to be up almost every time that there is a CC phase. So it's really nice. I have never used it successfully on Rigum, nor have I trusted my Golem to choose a correct trajectory. The problem is that when you're fighting a boss, the Golem is going to stand wherever it wants to stand, and it's just going to charge in a straight line from wherever it is. So even if it were to knock back in a straight line reliably, you can't. It's kind of hard to decide which direction it's going to go in. And you're absolutely right, Rav. When we had our last all Necro raid, the hardest boss of all the bosses we did was by far Samurag, and it wasn't for any other reason except trying to keep Rigum inside the stupid bubble. It made it really hard. We had to fear Yeah, we had to fear a lot, and it was really dumb trying to do it. I think we had 3 total groups of Necros, and only one group managed to get down the boss. So that was a huge challenge. Yeah, we did. We brought a lot of immobs. We really tried to keep that up, but it was pretty difficult. Okay, so again, we've got all of our minions doing a crap ton of damage, right? They're just going to be doing their own thing. We don't have to manage them at all. They're just going to be attacking whatever we attack. Very few things will cause your minions to die, so they'll be doing their own thing as well. Like I said, for CC, for hard CC, we have Wail of Doom, that's Warhorn 4. We have Charge, which is the elite skill of the Flesh Golem. You switch over to Greatsword. We have Grasping Darkness, which is Greatsword 5. That's a pull. Yep, that's a really good damage skill and CC skill. That is the only skill that we use during our DPS rotation that is also part of our CC rotation. It's on a 25-second cooldown, so it's pretty short. It may be up when you need it for CC, but even if it's not, we have access to a lot of other things. But don't be afraid to use it out of your rotation if we really need it for CC. I know you guys have seen what happens when we don't have enough CC in fights where that's mandatory. The other 2 CCs that we have access to are in Reaper's Shroud. So if everyone activates Reaper's Shroud right now, if you look at Reaper's Shroud number 5, Executioner's Scythe, it will do a bunch of damage or whatever, but it also does a solid stun. That'll do an actual stun. Number 3 in Shroud is called Infusing Terror. It's an interesting skill. If you activate it, it will apply an armor to you. For those of you who lost Shroud, by the way, if you activate the Mushroom King's Blessing, it will give you 100% Life Shroud again every time you click that. So we have access to unlimited Life Shroud or Death Shroud in here. So again, for Reaper Shroud number 3, if you click it once, it will activate a buff on you. But if you click it again, it will detonate that buff and fear every enemy around you. So fear is weird. It's like a hard, soft CC essentially. But please do use it in your CC rotation. So again, if I'm in a group that is struggling with CC and I'm fighting Samurog and we have to do a lot of CC, I go, okay, it's a lot on me. I got to make sure I do everything I have access to because I have access to a lot. So I'll do Greatsword 5, Weapon Swap, Warhorn 4. I'll do Charge. I'll pop into Reaper Shroud and do 5, and then 3, and then 3 again. So as you can see, I don't know how many other classes you guys have played, but there are some classes that have maybe 1 skill that's decent, right? Like maybe 2. We have a whole rotation that we can do in CC. There's a lot of skills we have access to. Okay, so that's CC. Are there any questions so far? I don't want to go too fast for anybody. Does anyone have any specific questions? Not boring anyone to death? Okay.
I love how there's so many passive things for this class. It was kind of a surprise when I found that out.
It's nice. I know, like some DPS rotations are phenomenally complex, and you have to use all of your utility skills. There's a lot of classes that use their utility skills and even their heal skill in their DPS rotation. So this class is really nice. You're actually going to have a chance to breathe during the fight, and this is one of the reasons that I really encourage people to learn raids on this class. This class, more than a lot of other classes, allow you to sort of pick your head up and look around. There's these spaces where you're going to be auto-attacking, and you can actually see the mechanics. Look at the boss, see where your group members are. A lot of the DPS rotations in this game, if you're not 100% fluent with them, you spend a lot of your time staring at your bar, right? If you're staring at your skill bar and getting really complicated rotations and getting lost, it's also hard to notice, maybe I'm standing in a teleport circle under Cairn, or I'm about to get hit by, eggs in Gorseval or something. Like there's a ton of things like that. Once you get this down, you'll know when you have to look at your bar and when you don't, and it's really going to make your life a lot easier. How reliant is Reaper on their auto attack chain, asks Mika in stream. For optimal DPS, it is important. that is going to be a little bit more of an advanced thing. So completing the auto attack chain in Greatsword will up your DPS. Completing your auto attack chain in Reaper's Shroud is definitely going to increase your DPS. But while we're learning this, it's not going to be as important. So we'll go into that later. When I get into the rotation, I'm going to teach you guys the core rotation, the simplified rotation, without the need to do that and without the need to have a different opener. But there will be room for further improvements for those of you who got it down really well, or you really want to push those numbers, say you really like Reaper and you want to get perfect. I would like you guys to reach out and maybe contact me afterwards for some more specific focus training on the refinement of it afterwards. But I think by the time you leave here, you'll have a really good grasp on the rotation. So the other things are the utility. I just saw Slaley use something that I want everyone to have good command of. It's so nice to have a travel skill on a class that you're bringing into raids, guys. So if everyone activates Reaper Shroud and presses number 2, I want you to see how far you go with that. It is really nice for travel. If you have an enemy targeted, it will travel you directly towards the enemy. But if you do not have an enemy targeted, it'll just shoot you straight forward in a line. If you get teleported out of position on Cairn, and you're like, oh crap, I'm going to get agony if I'm out here for too much longer. If you get teleported out of position on Veil Guardian, you can switch into this and be back to the group in no time. There are millions of reasons to have a good travel skill, even like in Doom, you got to get away for the bomb or anything like that. It's exceptionally powerful to use this skill when you need it. So this is what I mean by having access to utility and being aware of that utility, even if it's not part of your DPS rotation. And that's one of my favorite skills for that. It's really good. The other thing that I want you to be aware of in Reaper Shroud is number 3. Remember I said a moment ago, if you click 3 twice, it will fear enemies around you. But if you click it just once, it applies that buff to you. That gives you 3 stacks of stability. So you can apply your own stability, and what's really nice about that is that it's an instant cast skill. Whenever you click an instant cast skill, it does not interrupt any other skill that is currently being cast. So I told you that our auto attacks are important in Death Shroud. We're going to be using Death Shroud 4. Those things are really important. We wouldn't want to interrupt them, but the activation of number 3 in Shroud is instant. So you can just give yourself stability when you need to. So I want everyone to think about those moments, right? Gorseval, when he does the slam and you want somebody to give you stability and they don't, you can give yourself stability and rely on yourself. In KC, when he leaps up in the air and slams down and you have to dodge even though you don't want to, those kinds of things, giving yourself stability or having the ability to do that is exceptionally convenient. Okay, Unholy Feast is okay. That gives AoE cripple. So on times where we really want to cripple things, maybe when we're doing escort and we want to slow down the back warg or the front warg, that can be convenient. But you should also know that anything that you ever fight as a Power Reaper will be constantly slowed with either cripple or chill. Like it just happens passively. Your minions will apply cripple. Your auto attack applies chilled and greatsword. You really can just keep anything slowed, and it's really nice to be able to do that and to rely on it. Okay, number 5 in Warhorn. That is a swiftness. That is a source of swiftness for yourself, and that does come in handy sometimes if you don't have it from other sources. So if you press number 5, you give yourself the Locust Swarm. For those of you who played the rotation prior to this most recent patch, that used to be part of our DPS rotation. It is no longer part of our DPS rotation. We don't use that. So instead, it'll just be a source of personal swiftness that we can give ourselves. Okay, so does anyone have any questions? Am I going too fast? Please don't feel embarrassed if you have a question or if I am going too fast. This is definitely for you guys. I know how difficult it is to learn a new class. I really want you to get as much out of this as possible. So if you have anything, no, you can't have a cookie. I didn't bring cookies.
No cookies. What?
I know. I should have brought cookies and refreshments. All right.
Oh, is everyone inside who wants to be? Because I feel like we got a couple more people in the stream in
Yeah.
the Discord.
That's a really good question. If there's anyone who's in the stream who would like to be in the raid as well, we have people here who can leave, like Junie here. She knows the rotation, is just here to support. She doesn't actually have to be there, and she's in the same room as me. So if at any time anyone else wants to in the raid to start working on this as well, just let us know.
Yeah, I can very easily go out to the SFTA. I mean, outside the aerodrome.
Yeah, I think I might have to pop out, so if anyone wants the spot.
No worries, man. Okay, so now I'll kind of give you an idea of the way that the Reaper rotation works. So I'll break into the specifics in a minute. But basically, with the Power Reaper, your goal is kind of like it is with the Dragon Hunter. You're basically setting up a bunch of stuff, and then hitting this pinnacle point where you're doing a huge amount of burst, and then it sort of slows down again. Then you set up the burst again, and then it slows down again. The way that we do this, I want you to think of the rotation as ramping up into Death Shroud, the Death Shroud portion of the rotation, and then sort of ramping out of it. And then we'll ramp up into it and then ramp out of it. So that's how I want you to envision the rotation. It really does help you to sort of get an idea of what's going on. When we are in Greatsword, we're going to sort of start in Greatsword. We're going to do our skills. What I want you to pay attention to is that we are going to drop Nightfall. This is one of the more unique mechanics about the Power Reaper. We're going to drop Nightfall, which is Greatsword number 4. If you'll notice, that is a combo field dark. When we leave Greatsword, we're going to go into Axe. We'll do Axe 2 just for some damage, and then we'll do Well of Suffering, which is also a combo field dark. And right after that, we hop right into Death Shroud and hit number 4, which is our big spin to win for those who are familiar with the Reaper. Death Shroud right now and hit number 4. You'll see that you are spinning like crazy. The entire time you're spinning, you are doing a huge amount of power damage, but you are also in a constant state of whirl finisher. So if you are in a field and whirling, like I see Katie doing right now, what you will see is that you are casting leeching bolts. Now I know it's kind of interesting, right? Like we all started playing Guild Wars 2, we kind of became familiar with the fact that there are combo fields in this game, which seemed really cool, but they're, you don't really have a lot to do with them. They're almost accidental. In this class, it actually makes a difference, and I'll explain to you why. Whenever you do a whirl finisher with leeching bolts are the only bolt, which is the only projectile combo finisher, that does damage that is not condition damage. There are bolts that will apply conditions. Some are damaging, like fire bolts or poison bolts. Some or confusing bolts. Some are just status application, like vulnerability. Those are brutal bolts. But leeching bolts will do damage and heal you. They're like like a heal leech kind of thing. So they'll do damage and heal you in return. What makes it really interesting is that bolts that are leech bolts are the only bolts that do damage based on power, and they actually do scale off of your stat of power. So if you are doing leeching bolts, you're going to be doing a great deal more damage. And that is actually sort of part of the positioning factor that Reaper deals with. Whenever we go into Death Shroud and we hit number 4 and start spinning, our goal is actually going to be inside the enemy hitbox, not on the outside. And I'm going to spawn a golem so you can kind of get an idea what that looks like. Everyone target the golem. If you target the golem, you'll see that there's a big red ring around it. The red ring actually represents what the hitbox is. So it's not actually the it's not actually the graphic of the golem itself. It's the big ring that shows you how big it is. If I were standing right here and I were to do a whirl finisher with my 4, it look like this. Bolts that come out of me for the combo finisher will leave my body and go outward, but they go outward in random directions. So if you think about it, if I'm facing the golem right here and I'm standing right where I'm at, how many of those bolts do you think will actually hit the boss? It's about less than 50%, right? Maybe 40% of my bolts will actually hit the boss. If I'm standing here, actually inside the hitbox of the enemy, 100% of the bolts will end up hitting the boss. So this is, whenever I'm trying to help people refine their rotation, get a little bit more numbers out, this is one of the things that we do. Want to make sure that we're standing inside the hitbox because that's some extra damage. Okay? So essentially our goal... Alright, Rivem, I appreciate you coming, man. Thank you.
Thanks, Maeric. Sorry I couldn't stay for the whole time.
No worries. Hope you learned something.
Always.
So I do have a question about that because I am supposed to stand in the target on DH as well, but often during raids we get told to get out or there's danger of getting hit by the boss's attacks. Okay, so that is true for some bosses, and really it comes down to just knowing which bosses that's the case with. So, for example, some bosses, if you stand too close, you'll get aggro, or you'll get, like in Kadim, you'll get teleported. There's certain ugly things. Also in KC, when he's doing his pizza slice attack that rotates around, that will do huge damage to anyone that's under the boss. The danger donut. Yes, Angst. Thank you. So those are specific times where you don't want to. If you are doing Kadim, for example, you never want to. In KC, you only want to if he's not doing the danger donut. I love that term. Otherwise, it's perfectly fine. And really what we do with Power Reaper is we know it's only while we're doing the duration of that Power Reaper Shroud 4. That's only what, like 3 or 4 seconds. While we do that, we go in and then we can come right back out again. So it's just something to keep in mind for our whirl finishers. The same is true when we're doing Gravedigger, which is Greatsword 4. That's also a whirl finisher. So you can kind of pay attention to that as well. I want to tell you a general rule, Slayly, that will just apply to all raid bosses, but the truth is it does depend. It depends on which boss you're doing. Most of the time, it's a safe bet that you don't want to stand in front of a boss as a DPS ever, because you're just going to be taking unnecessary cleave damage. Just like I explained a little while ago what cleave damage does, bosses do it as well. So even if the tank is me, if you look at our right next to me here, the Flesh Golem, say that's you DPSing, they'll also get hit by anything that the boss is aiming at me to do. So you always try to be behind the boss, but stepping into the hitbox to do the Greatsword 4 and then stepping back out again is perfectly fine. Okay, so I'm going to give a little rundown of how to ramp up into our big damage portion and then ramp back out like I was talking about. Essentially, here is the gist of the rotation as we ramp up into Death Shroud. We're going to start in Greatsword. We're going to be at 100% life force when we start a raid, for example. But let me show you how easy this is going to be. We're going to do Greatsword 2, 3, 4, 5. All of them in a row, from left to right. 2, 3, 4, 5. Once all of those are done, we weapon swap into Axe. We'll hit Axe 2, and then the only utility skill that we use for the entire rotation, which is Well of Suffering. Once Well of Suffering is down, we go into Reaper Shroud. So that is our ramp up. That's how we ramp up into Reaper Shroud. It's very easy. Greatsword is where you start. 2, 3, 4, 5. Just run down the whole list from left to right. And then weapon swap. So if you can just practice that, get an idea for what that's going to feel like. So once you get 2, 3, 4, and 5, you'll weapon swap and hit Axe 2. Now Axe 2 has to channel. So you want to make sure that you... here, let me respawn this with a much larger amount of HP. Alright, there you go. So Greatsword is 2, 3, 4, 5. We weapon swap, and then we hit Axe 2. Once Axe 2 is fully channeled, we'll do Well of Suffering, the only utility skill, again, that we are going to be using ever. So it's pretty straightforward. And then we go into Reaper Shroud. So once we've done that, as I said, we'll have dropped 2 combo field darks on our way into Death Shroud. The moment that we pop into Death Shroud, we're going to hit Death Shroud number 4. That's the spin, right? The spin to win. What I want people to know at this moment is that this is your peak damage. This is where you don't want to be interrupted. You don't want to get knocked back. You don't want the boss to be moved away. You don't want to do this unless you're ready to do it for a full 4 seconds or whatever. This is our big portion of damage. And that's actually why this is one of the tricks that I give to people. That's one of the really nice things about having access to that Shroud number 3 that I told you about. It's almost like your own personal protection. Like, now I'm at the peak of my damage. This is the big burst. I'm going to hit Shroud 3, which is free and is instant cast, so it doesn't interrupt your rotation. And that'll give you 3 stacks of stability. That'll protect you while you're doing that part of your rotation. So you can kind of get in the habit of doing that. It also reduces the damage that you take. But it's really nice because it'll just give you some extra peace of mind that some stupid enemy isn't going to walk over and kick you while you're in the middle of your big burst damage rotation. So you can kind of get an idea of what bosses that might happen in, right? Like it can happen in Gorseval for tons of reasons. It can happen in Zera. It can happen in... someone give me some other things where you can get CC'd or
Sabbatha.
Sabbatha, thank you. That's a really good one. So there's lots of fights where that's the case, and this kind of gives you peace of mind. So for the next thing, just so you guys can see it, activate Death Shroud and then look at your health. Your buff bar. You'll see something that looks like a green star. It's called Soul Barbs. You all see that? It lasts for about 10 seconds and then it'll start flashing and disappear. And then when you leave Death Shroud, it'll come back again. Soul Barbs for another 9 seconds or so. Soul Barbs is actually given to you through a trait that we've chosen from the Soul Reaping line. It says entering or exiting Shroud. So if you go into Death Shroud or leave Death Shroud, you will actually gain this buff for 10 seconds, which will increase your damage by 10%. It's nice. Not something we really have to think about. It applies itself anytime we enter or exit Shroud. But we are going to use that as our counter. So when we go into Death Shroud, when we ramp into it, start a Greatsword, like I said, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way down the line. Weapon swap to Axe 2. Then we do Well of Suffering, the only utility we use, and go right into Reaper Shroud, where we will then activate Reaper Shroud 4 immediately. But after that, it's smooth sailing. We're just going to auto-attack. We're auto-attacking in Reaper's Shroud until you see that buff disappear. Reaper's Shroud, Soul Barbs, sorry. Soul Barbs, the little green star buff. You'll just kind of glance at it and see that it's flashing, and when it disappears, that's when we know to leave Death Shroud. Okay? You leave Death Shroud just by activating it again. So whatever that happens to be for you, if it's F1, which is what it is by default, you just tap F1 again when you see Soul Barbs fade. Alright, now we have gotten to the point where we've ramped up into Death Shroud and done the Death Shroud rotation. How nice is that? The Death Shroud rotation is 4. That's it. The rest of it is auto-attacking. So once we've finished that, we will then ramp out. Before I go any farther with this, I see most of you guys are practicing it, which is fantastic. That's what I love to see. Does anybody have any questions so far about the rotation? I feel like I'm talking too much, so if you do have any questions, please contribute.
So prior to the new balance patch, Warhorn 5 was used before you ran into Shroud to give you
Correct.
more going. Has that been kind of killed off?
It has been removed, yes. The change to Warhorn 5, they did something weird with it, like they made it more leechy and they made it do less damage over time and more damage up front, but whatever the overall effect was, it's nerfed it to the point where it's no longer worth casting. We will actually never use Warhorn 5 throughout the entire rotation. Which actually simplifies it, right? Once you it used to be that you would do the Greatsword portion, weapon swap, and do Axe 2, but then Warhorn 5 and then Well of Suffering before going into Shroud. Now we're just going to omit Locust Swarm and just do Axe 2 and then Well of Suffering. So you guys have actually learned most of the rotation. Isn't that crazy? And yes, Katie, oh my god, I spent like 40 minutes in the SFTA yesterday just trying to unlearn the portions of the rotation that were really hard for me to change. I've done so much Power Reaper now that it's really hard for me to change anything. Okay, so I know it seems crazy to think, but you've learned most of the rotation already. So the next portion is going to be the ramping out of Death Shroud. So we ramp up into it by doing what you've already done. We do Death Shroud number 4, and then auto attack until Soul Barbs disappears. Then we leave. And once we leave Shroud, what are we in? We're still in Axe, because that's what we were in when we activated Death Shroud the first time. So now to ramp out of Death Shroud, we're going to do the same thing that we did before. Well of Suffering is on cooldown. We're not going to use that, but since we're in Axe, we're going to use Ghastly Claws again, which is Axe number 2. So as soon as you're out of Death Shroud, activate Axe number 2, let it fully channel, and then go right back to Greatsword. So if you think about it, we're only in Axe briefly to ramp up into Death Shroud, and then we're only in Axe briefly just to use Axe 2 again to ramp back out of Death Shroud. Then we go right back to Greatsword. The rest of our life is going to be in Greatsword. Okay? So really simple so far. We start in Greatsword, go down the whole line from left to right. 2, 3, 4, 5. Weapon swap. Now we're ramping up into Death Shroud. So 2, Axe 2. Then we activate Well of Suffering, and then go into Shroud. We use Shroud 4 to spin to win, and then we just auto attack. Once Soul Barbs is done, we come out of Death Shroud by activating it again, and we ramp out of it by using Axe 2 one more time, and then we weapon swap back to Greatsword. Once we're back in Greatsword, this is the portion that it's actually really easy. Once you switch back to Greatsword, you're going to activate 3 and then 2. And there's a particular reason for this. 3 and then 2 once we're back in Greatsword, and then we're just going to auto attack. If you'll notice, when you swap to Greatsword, whatever portion of the rotation you're currently in, if you get to Greatsword again and activate 3 and then 2, which I'm going to do for the stream right now. Oh, never mind, it's at less than 50%. Hold on. That is the next chapter of the rotation. 1 second. Don't want to get ahead of myself. Okay, here it is. So if you watch the stream, for those of you watching in the stream, if you switch to Greatsword and you hit 3 and then 2, what that ends up doing is putting 2 and 3 almost on the same exact cooldown. Right? They're both going to come up at almost the same time. 2 is going to come up first and then 3 immediately afterwards. And that's what we want. So when we swap back to Greatsword, we start with 3 and then 2, and then we just auto attack until those 2 skills are off cooldown and ready to go. As soon as number 2 is ready again, then we have completed the loop. That is a joyous day for anyone who's learning a new DPS rotation, and I'm sure there's people here who know exactly what I mean. Once you've finally learned the rotation to the point where you've closed the loop, where you've reached the point where you're just starting again. All you've done is started from the beginning, and you already know the whole thing. That's it. You're done. Once you've swapped back to Greatsword and pressed 3 and then 2, then you just auto attack until number 2 is ready again. Once number 2 is ready again, you start from the beginning. You go 2, 3, 4, 5, all the skills from left to right, then weapon swap, Axe 2, it just goes exactly back to the beginning. If you guys are even close to caught up to what I've explained so far, you're essentially done. You've learned the whole rotation. That's how simple this rotation actually is. The only difference there is the joke that Katie just made a moment ago. When the enemy gets below 50% health, if everyone can mouse over their Gravedigger skill, which is Greatsword number 2. If you mouse over Greatsword number 2, it will say, perform a huge swing that deals heavy damage, recharges faster if it hits a downed or low health foe. What that means is if you look 2 lines below that, it says health threshold 50%. That means that if Gravedigger, which is a cleave skill, it spins around you in 360 degrees, right? If you use Greatsword number 2, you'll spin around in a circle and hit everything around you. If that skill happened to hit any enemy that is under 50% HP, even if the boss is at 99%, if the Gravedigger hits an enemy behind you by accident that is at 49.9% HP, it will actually instantly refresh the cooldown of Gravedigger. Gravedigger will actually be able to be used again immediately. So what you can do at that point is just cast it again. Why would you not? Gravedigger does a huge amount of damage, right? It's a great coefficient. Its damage, the base damage is 5100. Very strong. If it one-shots a Slubbling, do you still get the refresh? No, you don't. If you hit something from 100% HP and it kills it, it should not give you a refresh at all. But if it hits anything that is under 40 or under 50%, it will, and that's really strong in fights that have a lot of ads, right? Because those ads are getting cleaved down. You'll just be getting free Gravediggers throughout the fight. But also, once the boss gets to 49%, you can just Gravedigger like crazy. So what we're essentially going to do is replace the entire DPS rotation for the Greatsword. You know how it's supposed to be, we swap back to Greatsword and do 3 and then 2. And then once 2 is ready again, we do 2, 3, 4, 5. That is going to be replaced with, as soon as you swap from Axe back to Greatsword, you're just going to press 2, and then 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 2, and you're going to keep doing that until weapon swap is ready again. Once you're able to weapon swap back to Axe, then you can do 2, 4, 5, and then do the rotation as normal. Once we hit under 50%, the real change to the build is that we never use Greatsword 3 ever again. It will just be replaced by doing Greatsword 2 for days. But as soon as you can weapon swap again, you'll still do 4 and then 5 and then switch to Axe, and then we're ramping back up into Death Shroud, as I said before. So even that is just adding something new, but really the entire rotation is just those 3 steps. We're ramping up into Death Shroud, we're doing Death Shroud, and then we're ramping back out of Death Shroud. And that's pretty much it. So again, what I want people to really pay attention to, I made the hitbox on this golem a little bit bigger, so as long as you're standing within the ring, you're going to be getting every single one of the projectiles that comes from the combo finisher on a dark field. That's leeching bolts. Anytime you do Shroud number 4 and you're seeing leeching bolt, leeching bolt, leeching bolt, you are knowing you're increasing your damage by a decent amount, which is great. That's really what you want. So again, if you're in a sketchy situation and you don't want to screw up your big DPS rotation, make sure to use Shroud number 3 to give yourself some stability. That'll protect you while you're doing that. Remember, another really important thing to know about Power Reaper is that while you're in Shroud, every bit of damage that you take is doing damage to your total life force pool and not your actual hit points. That's both good and bad. It's actually really a double-edged sword. If, for example, you're doing no greens VG, or somebody misses a green, you're doing a regular greens VG, but the team misses a green. If you're in Death Shroud, you'll find that you'll just take no actual health damage, and everyone else may be dead or at least really low HP, and you're going to be at full HP. It's going to feel really good. But on the same note, it's actually going to reduce your damage, right? Because you'll have lost all of your Death Shroud, and you will not be able to do the rotation as normal because your life force is too low. Any ads dying in combat, in fact, any of your friends dying in combat too, all of that will give you life force. So 90% of the time in raids, you're not going to have a shortage of life force. It's going to be okay. Also, as you know, when we ramp up into Death Shroud or ramp out of it, we're going to use Ghastly Claws, which is X2. That builds up a good amount of life force. It's 12%. in a pinch, if you really need more life force, you can activate Haunt, which is the activated skill of your Shadow Fiend. If you activate the skill of the Shadow Fiend, it will give you 10% life force. The reason why we don't do this, even though the damage is more than its auto attack, it takes so long for it to activate. Like if you press it now, you can kind of see it like twitches and then teleports, and then there's a big aftercast. The truth is that it actually, the Shadow Fiend will do more damage if you don't activate that skill. But activating it doesn't kill the pet. So if you are low on life force and you need more, feel free to hit Haunt. You can hit number 9, and that will give you 10% life force, which is really nice. We are one of those interesting builds. In fact, this is unique in that our heal skill is a pet that is actually doing damage. We are getting healed by our pet over time. For every bit of damage that it's doing, it's going to be healing us. But if we sacrifice it by activating the skill again, number 6, that will give us more health but kill the pet. So you want to try not to do that. Remember, if you go into Life Shroud or Death Shroud, you will actually get a huge barrier of protection from your life force, which is good. And you can use that instead. Hopefully you'll get a heal. This is where the benefit of having so much HP comes in handy. You will probably be able to get a heal. But try not to overuse it, because if you do that, your pet is gone. You're going to have to summon it later again, which is a 1.5 second casting time, which doesn't do any damage. It's going to kind of gimp your DPS. You want to just try to leave it up to do its thing. You will be getting healing over time. There will never be any instance where we will use Signet of Spite, so don't have to worry about that. You'll never use that. I did tell you earlier that if you are needing to clear something at range, if you're doing orbs on Gorseval, for example, you can switch to your axe and use Axe 2. Axe 3 is also an AoE, which is ranged, which is kind of nice. And even if you're too far away to hit a target, if you were to target it and auto attack, all of your minions will directly go to it and start doing damage.
If you have any inquiries, come speak to me.
So that's pretty much it, guys. That is the majority of the stuff that you can learn about Power Reaper. The last thing is Greatsword number 5, Grasping Darkness. I would say that you can really use that in a clutch situation to gather enemies together. You'll see a lot of groups use Temporal Curtain for Chronomancer to get enemies into a nice little clump. You see that in Escort, where we're trying to get everything together so it can be cleaved down. No one cleaves better than you, so being able to actually gather enemies together into one spot for your own personal cleave is phenomenal. It's a really good ability. So if you're ramping up into Death Shroud, if you think about it, you're already doing it, right? Greatsword 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 will pull them all in. 4, by the way, is also applying blindness over and over again. So you're pulling enemies into you, and you're also blinding them. So for trash mobs, we're out in open world, it's incredibly strong. You are getting all the enemies in a nice little pile, and preventing them from actually hitting you with the blindness that's being spammed. Then when you weapon swap, you're going to end up doing X2, sure, but then you drop Well of Suffering again. That's another Combo Field Dark and a big AoE. So you've now gathered a bunch of enemies together, drop several AoEs on top of them, and then you pop into Reaper Shroud and spin to win. You will see huge numbers when you're hitting whole groups of enemies. I highly encourage every one of you to bring your Power Reaper out into the world, into open world content. If you do meta events, bring it to that. If you like just doing questing or even just story instances, start bringing it to guild missions. Go bring it to the metas that that your guilds do. You'll find that it is incredibly fun and so powerful in open world. I think it might be my very favorite build to bring into open world. So survivable. You're basically like a tank all by yourself, but can also gather enemies together and cleave like a madman. So you're basically set. You can kind of do anything you need to do. Yeah, Mika's right. There are also times where you want to be careful about the use of Greatsword 5. Because it does pull things in, you do have to be mindful of that, right? If you are, for example, fighting Goldem and Brigham, you don't want to pull him out of the bubble. You also shouldn't be using that skill anyway because it's a hard CC. But in Veil Guardian, where there's Seekers floating around, unless you're really, really sure about the direction you're facing, it's probably best not to use it because you could accidentally end up pulling a bunch of Seekers on top of the group. But it can also be really handy. You can help to pull something towards you. As long as you angle yourself correctly, it's another enemy movement skill, which I know you guys have seen in raids is really convenient, and in open world even more so. Okay, that is the entire rotation. I'm just going to go over it one more quick time. You start in Greatsword, go down the whole row, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then we weapon swap. Axe 2, the only skill we use in Axe. Then Well of Suffering, the only utility skill we use. Then we go into Death Shroud and hit number 4 immediately. Once we're done spinning, we're comfortable. We're just auto-attacking. And then we can just watch for Soul Barbs to disappear. Once Soul Barbs is gone, we pop out of it. We finish most of the rotation already. We ramp out of the Death Shroud now by doing Axe 2 again. The only skill we ever use in Axe. So if you're ever in Axe, you know you should be using Axe 2. And then that's it. That's all you need to do. Then we weapon swap. Back to Greatsword, and this is the only part that feels finicky, is you just activate 3 and then 2. Once you've done 3 and 2, you have officially restarted your rotation and you're at the beginning. Because as soon as 2 is available again, you're going to start over and do 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way down the row again. And you've started over completely. The rotation is complete. So remember, when you swap back to Greatsword, you do 3, 2. The next bunch of time is going to be auto-attacking in Greatsword until 2 is ready to go again. That's 8 seconds of just auto-attacking. So while you're in Death Shroud, after you touch the number 4 key and start spinning, you have a bunch of time where you are not pressing any buttons. Once you're back in Greatsword, after you do 3, 2, you have a bunch of time where you're not pushing any buttons. This is why when you guys see me lead raids in Guild Wars 2, especially in raid call heavy fights, I prefer to play Power Reaper. It is the most forgiving in that way. I really have the ability to look around, see where my teammates are, see what raid calls have to be made, make the calls that need to be made, and still not lose out on my DPS too much. One of the really nice things about this build is that even if your numbers feel low right now, even if you're getting, 15k, 20k, whatever you're getting now is going to be much closer to what you actually get in a real raid than if you were to play almost any other build in the game. And the reason is because the rotation is so reliable. Once you get this down, it's very simple, very predictable. You know exactly where your big damage is coming from. You can protect yourself while you're doing that damage. You'll be going down much less than any other character because you have so much access to health. And the rotation is simple, so you're not going to get messed up as much as you would by having to deal with mechanics and boss movement as you would with a class that has a really convoluted rotation. So you'll see me in here, if I do the rotation that I just taught you guys without a different opener, technically there is a different opener, the number that I end up getting is about 29.5. If I bring that into raids, I get the same thing. Even though you can see a thief that gets, 30... What do thieves get these days? 36? Something like that?
Like 33, 34.
35.
35. All right, so even if you got a thief at 35, or you have a power chrono, really good example, right? That's got like 37, 38, something like that. Even if you got really good at the power chrono and you were in the SFTA working on it and you managed to get 38k, or that thief manages to get 35k, why I've been bringing my Power Reaper to raids recently is so that you can see that even though the ceiling for this class is much lower, I'm still at the top of the DPS meters when we actually go into a raid, even when I'm in the same group as people who are playing much higher DPS builds. And it's because the rotation is so reliable. There's nothing that's going to stop me from being able to do my peak performance. So the ceiling might be lower, but I can reach that ceiling in a raid much easier than I could if I was playing Power Chrono. So I highly recommend you guys work on this. I know how hard it is. I've done it before with people. It's hard to work on a rotation or practice a rotation in front of other people. I hope everyone who wanted to get some practice on this did. Luckily, because it's such a crazy pet class and there's so many of us, you don't really feel isolated while you're working on it because there's so much mess happening around you. But if you want some one-on-one time afterward to really go over the specifics, I'd be more than happy to do that. Oh yeah, sure. The under 50% gets easier, not harder, and I know it might not feel like that at first, but remember the one part of the rotation that I feel is a little finicky is once you are ramping out of Death Shroud, you hit Axe 2, because you're going to be an Axe when you come out, and then you weapon swap and do Greatsword 3 and then 2, and then you wait until 2 is available again, and then 2, 3, 4, 5. Instead, under 50%, when you're ramping out of Death Shroud, you're going to be an Axe, like I said, you'll do Axe 2, and then when you weapon swap, all you will do is press 2. 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2. You'll just keep pressing 2. The way that you know to stop is we're watching our weapon swap timer. Remember, as soon as you weapon swap to Greatsword, we're spamming 2, but then once weapon swap becomes available again, we press 4 and then 5, and then weapon swap back to ramping up into Death Shroud. We'll weapon swap back to Axe and then do 2, and then Life Shroud is normal. So basically the only change is once we swap back to Greatsword, we just press 2 and 2 and 2 and 2 and 2, and then once weapon swap is ready, 4 and 5, and then weapon swap, and you're back to Axe and everything is normal as it has been. That will actually increase your damage. This is probably the only power build in the entire game that does more damage as the fight goes on, which is really interesting. So I always get really bummed out when I'm doing this DPS rotation because every power build starts high and then gets lower as it goes on. So I'll start, and I know what I'm shooting for is about 30k, right? That's where I want to be. And then the first number that's reported by the SFTA is like, you got 27k. And I'm like, oh man, that sucks. But then it actually goes up. Every time it reports it, it's going to be higher because once you get past 50%, Gravedigger increases your damage significantly. Okay, guys, that's been about an hour. I really hope that this was enjoyable and educational for some of you guys. I feel bad. I feel like maybe I just talked too much and you guys didn't get a chance to ask enough questions, but it does at least make for a very concise stream, which I'm going to be posting on both guild websites for people to check in with. Again, I am always available to help out. So if you have any specific questions you didn't feel like asking now, or questions that come up later as you're working on the rotation, or say you've got everything down, it feels great, and you want to push the numbers up a little bit more, I can help you with that too. But other than that, I think that's it. I think we'll call the training unless anybody has any last minute questions.
Appreciate it.
Sure, man.
Yeah, thanks.
Hope you guys had fun. I
Yeah,
hope to see a
useful.
lot more Power Reapers in raids coming soon. I know Remnants of Hope is going to be doing an all Necromancer raid next week.
Yes.
So for those of you in ROH, I hope that you learned enough to feel comfortable bringing it. And if you don't, then just, like I said, shoot me a PM. I'll work with you one-on-one until you get it right. And thank you everyone else who tuned in for the stream. I see 11 people here, which is fantastic. That's really exciting. If you guys have any questions also, you can send me a PM in game. I think I'm Viserys1498. There's my name. If you ever want to work on Power Reaper, I'm enthusiastic about it. I'm more than happy to work with you.
Hopefully we'll see everybody at the Necro Night.
Yeah, it should be fun.
Kind of try everything out.
Did you? I'm sorry,
Nick.
I wasn't here for the beginning of the stream. Did you talk about other offhand weapons that you may have besides?
I did not. There was a change that happened with Focus that was really nice. There are some other viable things, like if you, for example, if you play Scourge, obviously you're going to use Torch. That's more of a Condi weapon. If you are doing PvP, there's a lot of good reason to use Focus. But for the raid DPS build, it's still Warhorn, and I don't really know why, to be perfectly honest. Now that Warhorn 5 has been sort of mitigated, the CC on Whale of Doom is pretty much the only thing we use. If there was a DPS increase for... I was actually really excited when they changed focus. I was hoping that we would get to use focus.
Yeah, that's
But
true. What do we use on in Warhorn now? Just
we don't use 5
Whale?
unless we want the swiftness, and we don't use 4 unless we want the CC. So at this point, I think what you can glean from that is that even though focus is an alternative weapon, is that if we had focus on, we wouldn't use either skill on that either.
so it
I
could
think-
almost be at this point like if we're not going to be using the
Interchangeable
skills,
based on
it could
utility.
like or an extend or like well yeah utility and then for an even more frivolous reason but like what
Fashion.
skin you want to use. So fashion prevails again.
Well, it's true.
What?
You would not gimp your damage at this point.
Right, it would like if I wanted to, for instance, because I have a Warhorn on, but it's not like my favorite thing. If I wanted to like have this amazing hourglass, I could totally do that and not affect my damage
You
because it's
could.
a focus.
That's true. Where's Angst?
I'm unraveling
Onyx is
the
here.
entire
Whip
training.
out the Warhorn.
What?
You do have the Warhorn on that character, don't you?
This what?
No, she's got the legendary Warhorn.
Oh, oh yeah. Wait, let me see.
No, she doesn't have it on.
Oh,
What?
Tisk, tisk.
How do you not
Oh.
have your legendary Warhorn on?
I know,
Come
on a necromancer,
Because
no less.
it's on my other
Oh.
necro
Oh.
and my
Change the
druid.
skin.
Yeah.
On here.
Skin. Come on.
I forgot.
Man, if I had
Oh,
that
there were
Warhorn,
three. There were
I'd be
5
so
free
happy.
transmutations in the gem store yesterday.
Truth. Truth.
Totally used one of those.
Yeah, Power Reaper 10-man Wing 5 POG. What's up, Pina? I don't think so, bro. We are going to do an all-necro raid next week for the guild, but it's definitely not going to be Wing 5. That would
10
be brutal.
scourges, though.
10 scourges.
I
The
mean,
epidemic.
That'll have
that
to be
would
the
be
next
way more
one.
possible, at least for Soulless Horror. That would be not so
I
bad.
guess you would like a healer for that.
Now we're all necros. We should be fine. All the barrier. Okay, guys. Thank you, Nif and Mika and Pina, Haley. Those of you who tuned in for the stream. I'm gonna shut off the stream now, and then maybe I don't know if you guys want to do something afterwards, but we'll call it here. And thank you all for coming. You guys are awesome.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Maeric.
Cheers.
Thank you.